There's no one out there who doesn't feel a chill run down their spine when the name Adolf Hitler is mentioned. He's been dead for more than 75 years, and yet is still considered one of the most despised and controversial figures in the world. The man responsible for World War II, the Holocaust, and the most inhumane regime in human history, was an incredibly powerful dictator. But like every other dictator in history, Adolf Hitler was also met with an exemplary demise. With his death in 1945, an incredibly long and oppressive regime finally came to an end. Hitler's unnatural death and the details of his last few days as the Führer have been engulfed in a fog of mystery that is finally lifting. New information about the final days of the most despicable dictator of the 20th century has come to light recently, and it is shocking to say the least. Adolf Hitler was an Austrian-born German politician. He was born in April 1889 in a small town in Austria-Hungary. He was the fourth of 6 children, born to Alois Hitler and his third wife, Clara Pulz. When he was just 3 years old, Hitler's family moved to Passau, Germany, but they returned to Austria and settled in Leonding in 1894. Hitler's childhood was quite tumultuous, with intense conflicts between him and his father. Hitler refused to conform to the strict discipline of school, and for that, his father beat him, even though his mother tried to protect him. Like most Austrian Germans at the time, Hitler also developed the German nationalist ideas at a young age. He expressed his loyalty only to Germany and despised and declined his Habsburg monarchy. He, along with his friends, was known for using the greeting Heil and singing Deutschlandlied instead of the Austrian imperial anthem. When the First World War broke out in August 1914, Hitler was living in Munich, and he voluntarily enlisted in the Bavarian army. Later, in a report by the Bavarian authorities from 1924, revealed that allowing Hitler to serve was a grave administrative error because he was an Austrian citizen. But instead, he was posted to the Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment 16, where he served as dispatch runner on the Western Front in France and Belgium. While almost of his time was spent at the regimental headquarters, he was present at the First Battle of Ypres, the Battle of Somme, the Battle of Arras, and the Battle of Passchendaele. Hitler also got injured at the Somme, and for his bravery he received an Iron Cross, second class in 1914. Then again in 1918 he received the Iron Cross, first class, on recommendation by his Jewish superior, Lieutenant Hugo Gutmann. Hitler described the First World War as the greatest of all experiences. He was also praised by his commanding officers for his bravery. His wartime experience only reinforced his German nationalism, and Germany's capitulation in November 1918 shook him. He was bitter over the collapse of German war effort, and this was when he began shaping his ideology. When the war ended, Hitler returned to Munich and remained in the army as he lacked a formal education to pursue any other career. In 1919, he was appointed as an intelligence agent of the Reconnaissance Unit. He was assigned to influence other soldiers and to infiltrate the German Workers' Party. The party chairman was impressed with Hitler's oratorical skills and gave him a copy of his pamphlet called My Political Awakening. This pamphlet contains several anti-Semitic, nationalist, anti-capitalist, and anti-Marxist ideas. Hitler was then ordered by his superiors to join the party and was accepted within a week as the party member 555. According to reports, Hitler made his earliest known statement about the Jewish question in a letter to Adolf Gemlich, which is now called the Gemlich Letter. In this letter, he argued that the government's aim should be the removal of the Jews altogether. In March 1920, he was discharged from the army and began working for the party full-time. The headquarters of the party in Munich was a hotbed of anti-government German nationalists who were determined to crush Marxism and undermine the Weimar Republic. This was followed by several vitriolic beer hall speeches by Hitler that began attracting regular audiences. He used populist themes, including the use of scapegoats. He blamed for the economic hardships of his listeners. He employed personal magnetism and an understanding of crowd psychology to his advantage when he spoke to the public. Historians have noted that he had an almost hypnotic effect on them. Back in November of 1923, Hitler and his followers marched from the beer hall to the Bavarian War Ministry, hoping to overthrow the Bavarian government, but police dispersed them. 16 members of the Nazi Party and 4 police officers lost their lives in this failed coup. Meanwhile, Hitler had fled the home of Ernst Hansflesken. He was quite depressed and even contemplated dying, but he was later arrested for high treason. During his trial in the Special People's Court, Alfred Rosenberg became the temporary leader of the Nazi Party. In April 1924, Hitler was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment in the Landsberg prison. He received friendly treatment from the guards, who allowed him to see the mail from his supporters, and visits from party comrades were frequent. The Bavarian Supreme Court eventually pardoned him in December 1924, and he was released from jail. He only served a little over a year in prison, including the time on remand. While he was at Landsberg, Hitler also dictated most of the first volume of Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. This was the book that laid out Hitler's plans for transforming German society into a one based on race. In the book, the Jews were equated with germs and presented as international poisoners of society. His ideology stated that the only solution was to exterminate the Jews. He hadn't exactly described how to do it, but according to Ian Kershaw, his inherent genocidal thrust is undeniable. The book Mein Kampf was published in 2 volumes and sold around 228,000 copies between 1925 and 1932. 1 million copies of it were sold in 1933, Hitler's first year in office. After being released from the prison, Hitler rebuilt the Nazi Party and agreed to respect the state's authority. He promised that he would seek political power only through democratic process. Soon enough, the stock market in the United States crashed in October 1929. Germany was adversely impacted. Millions of people lost their jobs and several major banks collapsed. Hitler and the Nazi Party took advantage of this situation and rose to power. By 1934, Hitler and his allies had achieved full control over the legislative and executive branches of the government. They suppressed the opposition completely, and in July 1933, the Nazi Party was declared the only legal political party in Germany. Between June 30th and July 2nd, 1934, Hitler purged the entire SA leadership in the Night of the Long Knives. In August 1934, after Hindenburg's death, Hitler became the commander-in-chief of the armed forces and the head of the state. Hitler was incredibly clever, and he took care to give his dictatorship the appearance of legality. In March 1938, Hitler announced the unification of Austria with Nazi Germany and the Anschluss, which became the turning point in history as the events following this led to the beginning of World War II. The horrifying war that caused millions of deaths progressed into the next decade. In June 1941, more than 3 million Axis troops attacked the Soviet Union in an offense meant to destroy the entire Union and seize its natural resources for subsequent aggression against the Western powers. By August, the Axis troops had advanced 500 kilometers and won the Battle of Smolensky. After this, Hitler ordered Army Group Center to temporarily stop its advance to Moscow and divert the panzer groups to aid in the encirclement of Leningrad and Kiev. His generals did not agree with him on this decision, and this pause allowed the Red Army to mobilize fresh reserves. According to historian Russell Stoloff, he was one of the major factors that led to the failure of the Moscow offensive that resumed in October 1941 and ended disastrously in December. Hitler appointed himself as the head of the Oberkommando des Heeres during this crisis. After Japan attacked the American fleet based at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Hitler declared war against the United States. The German forces were defeated in the Second Battle of El Alamein in 1942, and Hitler's plans to seize the Suez Canal and the Middle East were crushed. Hitler had become overconfident of his own military expertise following the early victories in 1940. Soon enough, he became distrustful of his army high command, and he began interfering in their military and tactical planning. Hitler refused to allow the retrieval of forces in December of 1942 and January 1943 at the Battle of Stalingrad. This led to the complete destruction of the Sixth Army. Almost 200,000 Axis soldiers lost their lives as another 235,000 were taken prisoners. This was followed by a strategic defeat at the Battle of Kursk. It was evident that Hitler's military judgment had become increasingly erratic. Germany's military and economic position was deteriorating, and so was Hitler's health. Between 1939 and 1945, several plans were made to end Hitler's life, some of which actually proceeded to significant degrees. The most renowned of these was the 20 July plot of 1944. It actually conspired from within Germany and was partially driven by the realization that Germany was going to lose the war. It was part of the Operation Valkyrie and involved a bomb being plotted in Hitler's headquarters, called the Wolf's Lair by Klaus von Stauffenberg. Hitler narrowly survived because of a staff officer, Heinz Brandt, who moved the briefcase with the bomb behind the leg of a heavy conference table that deflected the blast. Afterwards, Hitler ordered savage reprisal that resulted in the execution of more than 4,900 people. In December 1944, Hitler was put on the United Nations War Crimes Commission's first-ever list of war criminals, according to British academic Dan Plesch. It was determined that he could be held criminally responsible for the acts of the Nazis in all occupied countries. By March 1945, around 7 indictments had been filed against him. By the end of 1944, both the Red Army and the Western Allies were rapidly advancing into Germany. Hitler knew that the Red Army was strong and determined, so he decided to utilize his remaining resources against the British and American forces, which he thought were much weaker. But after the failure of the Ardennes offensive, Hitler realized that much of Germany was in ruins. In January 1945, he spoke on the radio and said, "However grave as the crisis may be at this moment, it will, despite everything, be mastered by our unalterable will." He believed that Germany's military failures meant that the country had forfeited its right to survive as a nation. So he ordered the destruction of all Germany's industrial infrastructure before it was captured by the Allies. Hitler entrusted Albert Speer, the Minister for Armaments, with executing the scorched earth policy. But thankfully, Speer disobeyed the order. Hitler was also hoping to negotiate peace with the United States and Britain, particularly after the death of U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt in April 1945. Germany was on the verge of total military collapse early in 1945. Poland had already fallen to the advancing Red Army, and the Soviets were hell-bent on crossing the Oder and capturing Berlin. After the German forces lost the Ardennes offensive, the British and Canadian forces crossed the Rhine into the German industrial heartland of the Ruhr. Lorraine had also been captured by the Americans, who were advancing towards Mainz, Mannheim, and the Rhine. On January 16, 1945, Hitler retreated to his Führerbunker. It had become quite clear to the Nazi leadership that the Battle of Berlin would be the last one of the war in Europe. Around 325,000 soldiers belonging to Germany's Army Group B were surrounded and captured by the Ruhr Pocket. This left the path open for the U.S. forces to reach Berlin. When the news of President Franklin Roosevelt's death at his home in Warm Springs arrived, the German hierarchy celebrated. Joseph Goebbels said, "This is the turning point." The following day, Hitler himself reportedly reassured the nation and its battered troops fighting in the Eastern Front that relief was imminent. He assured them that Berlin would remain German, and Vienna, which had been seized by the Russians that very day, would soon be part of the fatherland again. However, this was nothing more than a perfectly illustrated delusion in order to ensure that the war effort continued. During the last 24 hours, the American troops had captured 2 heavy water piles at Stadlum on the River Ilm. This crushed any chances of the Germans developing an atomic bomb in the coming months. 2 days later, on April 15th, the German army launched a counterattack against the American forces near Uelzen. This was one of their final attempts to link up to their compatriots in the battle for Berlin, and this operation, like many others ordered by Hitler, was a grand failure. The Americans named it Operation Kaput and repelled Hitler's army using a brutal combination of artillery tanks and phosphorus weapons. The end of the Second World War was nigh by this time, and it was evident that the final days of the Nazi regime had begun. In the early hours of April 16th, the Soviets began their offensive attack against Berlin, with more than 20 armies, 2.5 million soldiers, and 40,000 mortars and field guns. Hitler's position was absolutely hopeless, and it was beginning to dawn on him too. By 19th April, the Germans were in full retreat from the Seelow Heights, which was the last major defensive line protecting Berlin on that side. There was no front line left. Deep inside the Führer's headquarters was a bunker buried around 50 feet below the Reich Chancellery, where Hitler was hiding. The Soviet army's attack was met with an air of resignation by the Nazi leadership. On Hitler's birthday, April 20th, Berlin was bombarded for the first time by Soviet artillery. The same day, the leaders of Hitler's regime met for the very last time among the bleak environment created by the naked light bombs, a failing water supply, and the rancid smell of human waste inside the bunker. It was Hitler's birthday, after all, so the meeting was moved from the bunker to the larger rooms of the Chancellery. Here, most of the guests were anxious for this celebration to end. The Red Army tanks had encircled Berlin, and the escape routes were shrinking by the hour. By the evening of April 21st, the Red Army tanks were already on the outskirts of the city. Despite the impending doom, Hitler appeared determined to fight till the very last moment. He even emerged into the daylight in order to encourage and decorate a collection of battle-weary soldiers and members of the Hitler's youth. He gathered all his strength and said, "Heil euch," but there was no response. The only sound that could be heard was the rumbling of not-so-distant Soviet artillery. Hitler ordered a special detachment commanded by SS General Felix Steiner to counterattack the Soviets on April 21st. But the next day, Hitler suffered a nervous collapse at the afternoon Situation Conference when he was told that these orders have not been obeyed. The dictator with a wounded ego launched into a tirade against his generals. He called them treacherous and incompetent. And finally, for the first time ever, Hitler declared that the war was lost. His lethargy was quite noticeable by now. In fact, the man wasn't well, and it was quite evident. His complexion was pasty, and his features were puffy. Heavy bags were weighing down his bloodshot eyes. The unsteady gait and the permanent trembling of the left hand of the man who once was one of the most powerful dictators in the world gave the impression that the frailties were for dramatic effect. But this wasn't true. Contemporary analysis has actually revealed that he was most likely suffering from Parkinson's disease. Although he knew that it was inevitable, Hitler was quite astonished by the realization that the Soviet army had arrived at his doorstep so quickly. He openly blamed his cowardly generals for the Nazi failings. He would often come indignant and claim that he had been betrayed by those in a hole he had placed in his trust. The first such act of betrayal was when Heinrich Himmler unsuccessfully tried to negotiate Germany's terms of surrender with the Western Allies, excluding Russia. The second one was when Hermann Göring, who was Hitler's head of the Luftwaffe, sent his Führer a telegram proposing that he assume full control of Germany. Göring said, "If no reply is received by 10 o'clock tonight, I shall take it for granted that you have lost your freedom of action." This didn't settle well with Hitler, who immediately dismissed his one-time confidant and ordered his arrest on the grounds of high treason. Around 2 days later, on the 25th, Hitler also ordered the arrest of General Karl Windling, a commander of the Panzer Corps. He was accused of desertion, but in reality, Windling was continuing to fight on the outskirts of Berlin. He was summoned to the bunker where he immediately protested his innocence, after which he was appointed as battle commandant of Berlin. This erratic and schizophrenic behavior was proof that Hitler's thought process was as confused and chaotic as Berlin itself. Every morning, makeshift units were being sent out to reinforce street barricades, trenches, or building shelters. Factories and workshops ceased operations. Using electricity was forbidden, and those who broke this law were punished by death. Talk of effective methods of taking one's life pervaded among the people. But this talk wasn't limited to the general populace. Inside his bunker, Hitler himself was oddly calm and melancholic. He spoke of death as some sort of release. By then, all hope was gone, and the perceived betrayal by Göring and Himmler only further devastated Hitler. His dream of his ideology had died with the millions of soldiers he had ordered to continue fighting hopeless and futile battles that were already lost. According to reports, Hitler had inquired from the SS physician Werner Haas about the most reliable method of taking one's life. Haas then suggested what he called the pistol and poison method. Hitler openly announced that he would remain in Berlin until the end and then end his life. After he received a telegram from Göring asking for permission to take over as the leader of the Reich, Hitler sacked him from all offices and ordered his arrest. He also ordered his chief aide and adjutant, Julius Schaub, to destroy all safeguarded documents and his personal train. By 27th April, Berlin's communication from the rest of Germany had been cut off. All the secure radio contact with the defending units had also been lost, so the Führer bunker had to rely on telephone lines for passing instructions and orders. The Red Army had advanced to the Pulitzer Platz and were preparing to storm the Reich Chancellery. This report, along with the news that Himmler had offered to surrender to the Western Allies, prompted Hitler to make the final decisions for his life. After midnight on the 29th of April, when the Russians were no more than 24 hours away from gaining complete control over Berlin, Hitler married Eva Braun in a small civil ceremony in a map room inside the Führer bunker. The newlyweds then hosted a modest wedding breakfast. After eating, Hitler took secretary Charlie Jung to a different room and dictated his last will and testament. He left instructions that were to be carried out immediately after his death. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz and Joseph Goebbels were supposed to assume Hitler's roles as the head of state and chancellor, respectively. He signed these documents at 4 a.m. and went to bed. On the afternoon of 29th, Hitler was informed by his ally Benito Mussolini and his mistress Clara Petacci had been executed by Italian partisans. Their bodies had been treated brutally by the Italian dissidents. This news strengthened Hitler's resolve to ensure that he and his wife were not made a public spectacle like Mussolini and Petacci. Hitler had been given some capsules of prussic acid by Himmler through SS physician Ludwig Stumpfegger. He had intended to use these capsules for himself, but when the news arrived that Himmler had contacted the Allies through a Swedish diplomat to arrange the end of a war, Hitler was outraged. Considering this betrayal, he began to doubt if the capsules would be effective, so he ordered Hasi to test one on his dog, Blondie. The capsules worked, and the dog passed away instantly. Some sources state that the thought of his beloved companion falling into Russian hands was unacceptable for him. That is why he used the capsule on Blondie. On April 30, the bunker residents woke up to the sounds of artillery fire at 5 a.m. Within the next hour, the bleary-eyed Hitler in his dressing gown and slippers was informed that they were a few hours away from defeat. In the afternoon, Hitler had his last meal, after which he got up and said, "The time has come. It's all over." Goebbels, who had always insisted that Hitler remain in Berlin, was now trying to convince his Führer to leave the city, but Hitler refused and bid him farewell. After saying his goodbyes, Hitler finally returned to the private rooms to get dressed. A while later, he walked into the large conference room wearing his uniform jacket and his Iron Cross. Braun was also at his side. Hitler exchanged a few words with the congregation that had gathered. He was once again requested to flee the city by a teary-eyed Magda Goebbels, but he again refused. He had already been informed by Wilhelm Keitel that the forces he was relying on to save Berlin had either been encircled or forced into a defensive. Hitler and Braun then retired to his personal study while the adjutant SS Sturmbannführer Otto Gunsch stood guard outside the door. At this point, accounts vary, but the consensus is that a shot was heard at 3:30 a.m. Shortly after, Heinz Ling, Hitler's aide, smelled gunpowder and bitter almond, so he went inside the room. Bormann, Otto Gunsch, and a major in the SS also followed suit. They discovered Hitler slumped on his sofa. His eyes were open, and there was a coin-sized hole in his right temple. Eva Braun was right next to him, wearing a blue dress. Her knees were drawn into her chest, and her lips were pressed together. According to Lung, she had only used the capsule. Gunsch left the study and announced the news of Hitler's death in the briefing room. The bodies were viewed by Goebbels, Krebs, Wilhelm, and others who were present. Afterwards, as per Hitler's instructions, the bodies were taken out of the bunker into the gardens behind the Reich Chancellery. After setting fire to the remains of the Führer, the group, including Bormann, Linge, Gunsch, Kempke, Holgel, Reiser, and Lindhoff, raised their arms in salute while standing in the bunker doorway. Afterwards, Hitler's study and his belongings were also burned. Not long after, the Red Army overpowered the Reich Chancellery, but never found anything except for the dental remains of Braun and Hitler. On the evening of 1st of May, Magda and Joseph Goebbels, along with their 6 children, also died. A week later, the Third Reich officially ended with Germany's unconditional surrender.